In this final video on Revelation 18, we will take a look at the collapse of the labor force connected with Mystery Babylon, as well as what Revelation means when it refers to the sorcery of Mystery Babylon. The merchants of these wares, who gained wealth from her, will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste, and all shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea, stood far off, and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning, "What city is like this great city?" And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, "Alas, alas, for the great city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her." Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, "So will Babylon the great city be thrown down with violence, and will be found no more." And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more, and a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more, and the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more, and the light of a lamp will shine in you no more, and the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more, for your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all the nations were deceived by your sorcery, by your pharmacia. We'll talk about that more later. And in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and all who have been slain on the earth. Woe to the great city. Now, in John's context, wealthy merchants sent out huge ships and also enjoyed favorable tax status from Rome. And this is why this is most likely just a critique of the arrogant rich. It takes a shot at all those who have ships on the sea and who have boats on the sea. But you may read this and wonder, is this what about the small guy? What about the little fisherman? Well, they're probably not part of this this condemnation as indicated by the context, as Osborne says. Well, here we're talking about the lords of the sea who were forcing out small competitors to make profit. And again, you've seen this in our own economy, where big corporations swallow up the small ones. They swallow up the mom and pops establishments. Thus, small ship owners are probably not a part of the list because they themselves were often oppressed and bankrupt. Idolatry. Who is like this city? This parallels what was said about the beast earlier. Who is like the beast? This parallels these Old Testament formulas that were used. Who is like Yahweh? Who can make war with Yahweh, etc. Throughout Revelation, we have found that idolaters use these same formulas that should only be used of God. The idolaters use these formulas in reference to their favorite countries, their favorite cities, to their favorite systems. Behind this is also Ezekiel 27, where this same idolatrous language is used. Who is like Tyre, surrounded by the sea? And we'll talk more about Tyre in a moment. And they threw dust on their heads and were crying out, weeping and mourning, saying, "Woe, woe, the great city, in which all who had ships at sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she has been laid waste." This language comes from Tyre in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 27, where it says, "All who handle the oar, the sailors, and the pilots of the sea will come down from their ships. They will stand on the land, and they will make their voice heard over you, and will cry bitterly. They will cast dust on their heads. They will wallow in ashes." As Fee said, God is going to judge Rome in part because, like ancient Tyre, she is using her dominance of the sea, now with the protection of the imperial armies, to set in motion a lifestyle that is utterly over against the living God, both in terms of God's essential character and God's self-revelation as the protector of the poor. This, in turn, is what makes sense of the sudden, totally unexpected response by John that comes next, when he summons heaven and the saints and the apostles to praise God, to shout and rejoice because Babylon has fallen. Now, ancient Tyre, of course, is more so than any other Old Testament enemy of Israel. This is the one that dominated the oceans, and because they had all these ships and all this power at sea, they were able to use that as a military advantage, and they oftentimes attacked people who did nothing to deserve being attacked and reduced them to slavery. So Tyre is a good picture of Babylon in the way Babylon uses its maritime advantages. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. This language also comes from the judgment of historical Babylon, back in chapter 51 of Jeremiah. Then heaven and earth and all that is in them will shout for joy over Babylon, for the destroyers will come to her from the north, declares the Lord. Babylon must fall because of Israel slain, just as the slain in all the earth have fallen because of Babylon. So here again we see that, yes, God judges Babylon because of the way Babylon has killed God's people. But that's not the only reason. It's also because Babylon has killed other people, including those who are not in covenant. Revelation is mostly concerned with the fact that the saints are being murdered by an antichrist figure, but not exclusively just for God's people. Other people are part of the purview of concern here. And notice also this change. In Jeremiah, it says heaven and earth. Well, in Revelation, those who celebrate are, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets. And this could be translated, and some scholars will suggest the idea here is, O heaven, that is, even you saints and apostles and prophets. We've seen a number of times in the book of Revelation that even when the church is on earth, even when the saints and apostles and prophets are on earth, they're still being discussed as though they are in heaven because they have a heavenly identity. They have a heavenly presence. We've seen this many, many times in the book of Revelation through colonizing the earth, that is, through bringing kingdom ethics and kingdom justice to the earth. We are remaking the earth in heaven's image. The name of the game in Christianity is not just to die and go to heaven, but before you die, to make sure that your life is such that you brought heaven down to earth. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, So will Babylon the great city be thrown down with violence and will be found no more. This is a great place to see the way that Revelation integrates so many biblical sources into a single thing. And here we have Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Matthew all being brought together. Now in Jeremiah 51, Jeremiah commands his servant Sariah to bind a stone on a book containing the prophecy of Babylon's judgment and cast it into the Euphrates. So that is clearly a scene that is being reproduced here. However, we've seen that this prophecy is also against Mystery Babylon as being the new Tyre, the new city that dominates the sea. Tyre stones will be cast into the midst of the sea, and you will never be found again. That language from Ezekiel 26 is definitely here as well. But you'll notice that this prophecy against historical Babylon in Jeremiah and against Tyre in Ezekiel, neither of these contain a reference to a millstone, as here in Revelation. Where does John get the millstone reference? Well, that comes from Jesus. Jesus warns whoever leads astray one of his followers that it would be better that a millstone were tied around his neck and he would drown in the sea. And then in verse 7, right after that, Jesus pronounces two woes. Well, that same thing happens in Revelation. You have the millstone cast into the sea, and then you have the pronouncement of woes. And so Jeremiah prophesies against Babylon, and Ezekiel against the seafaring nation of Tyre. That has definitely been brought together here for Mystery Babylon. But Mystery Babylon is also an obstructor of faith and faithfulness. She sets a stumbling block in front of God's people through culture and materialism. And we've seen at the beginning of this chapter, in chapter 18 and verse 4, that God's people are called out of her so that they do not partake in her sins and share in her plagues. And so she is a stumbling block to the world. And so naturally, this passage where Jesus is warning against those who set a stumbling block before you, it's naturally integrated here with this language of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. So you have three biblical threads that have been tied together here in Revelation, and such is the practice of John throughout this book, his his use of the Old Testament is so complex. I like this piece of church art where the angel casts the millstone into the sea. I don't know, the angel's just kind of strange. He's all big, and I guess it's kind of humorous to me. This person in the boat who's kind of like, oh no, he's going to drop a millstone on me. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more, and a craftsman of any kind will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more, and the light of a lamp will shine in you no more, and the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. Now, this language also comes from the Old Testament. This time, it's a language that was used against Judah in Jeremiah 25. Judah, after she'd sinned against the covenant. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstone and the light of the lamp. This whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Now, this is interesting because in this passage in Jeremiah, Babylon, historical Babylon, is God's instrument of judgment. Now, in this Revelation passage, Babylon, Mystery Babylon, is the recipient of judgment. So there's an irony here. What Babylon dished out in the Old Testament now comes upon Mystery Babylon in the New Testament. Again, a stroke of the poetic justice that John oftentimes narrates throughout the book. No craftsman of any kind will be found in you again. Now, why would the book of Revelation take a shot at the craftsman? The Old Testament doesn't have a specific prophecy against artisans. This is likely original to Revelation and is a response to Christians being expelled from the trade guilds because they would not receive the mark of the beast and swear their allegiance to Caesar or his gods. We've talked about this many times. If you want a fuller presentation on this, you should watch the last video in Revelation 13. And, basically, in the trade guilds, you had to be a member of the trade guilds to be of any real consequence in the local economy. But in the trade guilds, you had patron gods, you had Caesar being, proclaimed as a god, you had women brought in to service the men, and so there's a fornication issue, and Christians cannot be involved in the trade guilds without compromising. Now, Christians who compromise their faithfulness for the sake of economic advantage and join the trade guilds anyway, these are those who are counted as having taken the mark of the beast. Again, I encourage you to go back and watch that presentation in chapter 13 if you haven't seen it. And so this is likely why craftsmen are targeted here. The Christians are not invited to participate in the guilds, not without compromising, relevant to different types of crafts. And so those industries, those guilds, those practices are specifically pointed out and destroyed because how unfriendly they were, or how they were a stumbling block to try to get Christians to economically compromise. I want to show you something that really wears me out. There is this teaching, which I've encountered a number of times in my 11 or 12 years as a Christian, which suggests that you're not supposed to take medicine prescribed at the pharmacy. And the reason why is this passage here. This word for sorcery. All the nations were deceived by your sorcery. It comes from the Greek word pharmakia. And you don't have to know Greek to see the link between the word pharmakia and our English word pharmacology or pharmaceutical or the pharmacy. And so a lot of folks, well, I don't want to say a lot, but they're a fringe group, but they're kind of a noisy fringe group, will suggest that when Christians participate in modern medicine, we are partaking of sorcery. We are partaking of pharmakia. And if you haven't encountered this, this probably sounds strange to you, but there are people who take this very seriously. I knew a guy who argued this point with me a lot. And I tried to tell him, scholars generally understand pharmakia to be a reference to sorcery. If it involves the ingestion of, of anything, it's in reference to these rituals. It's not modern medicine. It's not, well, let's use the properties of things we find in the creation to enhance our own immune system based on our understanding of how the immune system works. That's not what the Bible is condemning. But he would show me places in the Greek literature, uh, like with Hippocrates or another Greek doctor who would use the word pharmakia just in reference to natural medicine, and uh, and so he thought that was conclusive then that Revelation really is condemning the practice of medicine. Well, the issue is Revelation is not quoting Hippocrates. It's not quoting any other ancient Greek sources. It's quoting the Old Testament. Now, if pharmakia in the Old Testament passage is a reference to medicine, then yes, Revelation is condemning medicine. But if it's a reference to something else, well, then Revelation is not condemning medicine. And what we'll find is pharmakia in this passage in Isaiah refers to spells that are cast for the sake of financial gain and for the sake of military dominance, and spells that are cast in conjunction with the placement of astronomical bodies. Here's the passage. But these two things will come on you suddenly in one day, loss of children and widowhood. They will come on you in full measure in spite of your many sorceries, in spite of the great power of your spells. This sorceries here, this is pharmakia. This is the passage that Revelation is quoting. Stand fast now in your spells and in your many sorceries with which you have labored from your youth. Perhaps you will be able to profit. Perhaps you may cause trembling. You see here, profiting and causing trembling on one's enemies. That's the kind of spells, that's the kind of sorcery we're talking about here. We're not talking about medicine. You are wearied with your many counsels. Let now the astrologers, those who prophesy by the stars, those who predict by the new moon, stand up and save you from what will come upon you. This is not a context of medicine. This is astrological prognostication. This is casting spells on your enemies so that you have leverage over them, so that they fear you. There's nothing in the context here that supposes the acquisition of knowledge pertinent to the physical characteristics of the human body and the way they interact on a natural level, with plants, herbs, chemicals, whatever, in order to enhance the immune system or to promote health and wellness. This is just silliness to use this. And the guy I talked about that I've argued this with the most, I asked him, should we be able to give anesthetics to children if they're going to have a serious surgery? And his response was, I would rather be honest with my body, right? Well, okay, you can be honest with your body, but once the surgeon's knife begins to cut into your bone, you may have a different perspective. Uh, this is, I just think it's religious buffoonery, and it can obviously dovetail nicely with the, things you hear sometimes from charismatics and Pentecostals that you shouldn't need a doctor of medicine if you just believed you would be healed. And so you get that kind of super spiritual talk, and you cross it with a poor misunderstanding of pharmakia here in Revelation 18, and you end up with some very funny doctrine. Uh, Usually, in Judaism and Christianity, scientific medicine has been thought to fall under the dominion mandate that was given to Adam. Adam was told to have dominion over the creation and over all the life and things that God had made. And theologically, people have understood, for a very long time that included all forms of industry, all sorts of disciplines, all sorts of sciences, including medicine, that part of having dominion over the creation is to learn the properties of the creation and to use that knowledge and to utilize it to enhance human wellness. Uh, Medicine falls under the dominion mandate. So there is no question as to whether or not theologically medicine is okay. This is just a strange thing for people who get so caught up um, straining out the gnats of their religiosity that they end up swallowing a camel and trying to, keep people from anesthetics and surgery and all sorts of things. Uh, there's a great book I read recently called Caesar's Last Breath, and it basically is documenting scientific progress in reference to the chemicals that make up our atmosphere. And as it goes through the story, somehow it begins to talk about the development of anesthetics. And before we had good anesthetics and people just had to be strapped down or held down for surgeries, and people would start cutting them up to try to help them, people would walk away from that sort of thing with serious psychological damage. People who had had these awake surgeries with nothing to numb the pain, they would often be damaged for the rest of their life. Their minds would be ruined. Someone's cutting them up. And so this is just very foolish. I strongly encourage you to stay away from religious expressions like this one. Justice poetically explained, as it oftentimes is in Revelation. Notice how this formula keeps repeating itself. And all things that were luxurious and splendid have passed away from you, and men will no longer find them. So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence, and will not be found any longer. And no craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer. Now, why does it keep saying this, that things will not be found in Babylon? It's because, and in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and all who have been slain on the earth. All right, once God found so much blood in her, uh, poetically, this is expressed that nothing else will be found in her again. All this luxury, all these weddings, all this merrymaking and song, that will not be found in her, specifically because the blood of prophets and saints, and including outsiders, those outside the church, all of those who've been slain on the earth, that blood was found in Mystery Babylon. So throughout chapter 18, as well as in chapters 16 through 17, descriptions of Sodom and Gomorrah, Babylon, Tyre, Nineveh, Edom, and Jerusalem have been applied to the ungodly system that trusts only in itself. All these Old Testament oracles, especially those concerning Babylon and Tyre, are now applied to Rome in John's day. But Rome, again, in turn, is just a picture of other ungodly communities that have existed from the first century until now. This use of descriptions of various wicked nations spanning so many epochs points further to our conclusion that the Apocalypse's mystery Babylon is not just one satanic nation or city, but is a corporate, depraved worldwide system that spans the ages since the beginning of the human civilization all the way down into the time of the second coming. Since the book of Revelation, and particularly this chapter, have warned Christians to not get caught up in the culture and the materialism and the entertainment that distract us from the kingdom, I'll finish this chapter by giving the last word to Jesus. But woe to you who are rich, for you are receiving your comfort in full. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and